Why the Mormon Church is quietly buying farmland across America. Most people think churches focus on building temples, chapels, and community centers. But one church has been doing something very different and doing it quietly. Across America, from Florida's cattle fields to California's citrus groves and the timberlands of the Pacific Northwest, the Mormon Church has been buying vast amounts of farmland. Not a few acres, but entire landscapes. Enough to rival the size of some U.S. states. And here's the part almost no one talks about. This isn't just investment. It isn't just money. There is a strategy, a long-term plan rooted in a belief system over a century old. So the real question is this: why is the Mormon Church quietly buying farmland across America? And what do they know that the rest of us don't? Welcome back to the channel. Here, we explore stories that shape power, belief, and the long-term strategies that most people never stop to question. If you're new, I'm glad you're here. And before we go any further, let me make something clear. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not an attack on faith. And this is not an expose designed to shock. What you're about to hear is a factual, researched look at one of the most quietly strategic operations in modern religious history, carried out by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often known as the Mormon Church. If you appreciate deep, respectful investigations into topics that challenge how we see the world, consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow, and it enables us to bring more stories like this to light. Now, to understand how we got here, we need to begin with one simple question. How much land are we actually talking about? To understand why this story matters, we first need to confront the sheer scale of what the Mormon Church owns. Because this isn't a small collection of church farms or community gardens. This is an agricultural footprint so large, so widespread, and so meticulously organized that most people, including many church members, have no idea it even exists. Through a network of corporate entities such as Farmland Reserve Inc., AgReserves Inc., and Deseret Ranches, the church controls an estimated 1 million acres of farmland across the United States. 1 million acres. Let that number sit for a moment. That's not a metaphor. That's not speculation. That's documented land. To visualize it, imagine the entire state of Rhode Island. Now imagine all of that land privately owned by a single religious institution. And that's just in the US. Their global holdings extend even further into Canada, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Australia, and parts of Europe. But let's stay in America for a moment, because the map alone tells a powerful story. In Florida, the church operates Deseret Ranches, one of the largest cow-calf operations in the entire nation. Nearly 300,000 acres of cattle, citrus groves, sod production, and experimental agricultural systems. In Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma, they own enormous tracts of wheat, corn, and feed crop farms, often purchased quietly through subsidiaries to avoid public attention during acquisition. In Idaho and Utah, they control orchards, grazing lands, potato farms, and water-rich pastures that feed both commercial markets and church welfare programs. In the Pacific Northwest, they own sprawling timberlands, forests that are not just environmentally valuable, but financially strategic thanks to timber production and long-term land appreciation. These aren't abandoned fields or passive real estate plays. These are active, industrial-scale operations, some of the largest private agricultural enterprises in America. Financial analysts estimate that the church's total portfolio, including agricultural land, commercial real estate, residential development, stocks, bonds, and income-generating businesses, exceeds $100 billion, with some reports suggesting the true number could be significantly higher. But here's the key point. Farmland is not a small footnote in that portfolio. It is one of its foundations. And this raises a crucial question. Why would a modern religious institution quietly build one of the largest agricultural empires in the Western Hemisphere? That is where the story becomes far more interesting, because to understand their strategy, you have to understand their history. To understand why farmland plays such a critical role in the Mormon worldview, We need to step back nearly 2 centuries, to the earliest days of the faith when survival wasn't philosophical. It was literal. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was born in the 1830s, during a time when its earliest followers faced intense persecution, violent mob attacks, and repeated expulsions from state to state. They were driven out of New York, then Ohio, then Missouri, and later Illinois. Their settlements were burned, men were killed, and families were left homeless in the depths of winter. For early Latter-day Saints, food was not guaranteed, and security was never promised. They lived with the constant threat of hunger, displacement, and scarcity. And from this history emerged one of the defining principles of the faith, self-reliance. But not self-reliance in the modern personal responsibility sense, something much deeper. It was collective survival, communal preparedness, a belief that the only way to endure the hardships of a broken world was to build a system where the community could produce, store, and control its own resources. Joseph Smith, the founding prophet of the LDS Church, introduced teachings known as the law of consecration and stewardship. These teachings emphasized building and preserving resources, sharing among the community, preparing for future tribulations, viewing land as sacred stewardship, creating systems where no one would go hungry. This wasn't abstract doctrine, it was the roadmap to survival. When the saints eventually fled west under Brigham Young and settled in the barren deserts of Utah, the idea of make the desert blossom as a rose became both prophecy and necessity. They dug irrigation canals, planted orchards, grew wheat, raised cattle, and learned to turn desolate land into functioning civilization. Food storage wasn't just encouraged, it was life or death. Agriculture wasn't optional, it was the backbone of the community. Land wasn't an asset, it was salvation. Over time, these practices became a cultural inheritance. Even today, Latter-day Saints are encouraged, though not required, to maintain a supply of food and essentials that can last months. Families teach their children gardening, canning, and emergency planning. Church leaders routinely speak about being prepared for natural disasters, economic instability, and unexpected hardship. But here's the part most people miss. The early LDS emphasis on food, land, and preparation never faded away. It simply scaled. What began as families storing wheat in barrels eventually evolved into one of the most sophisticated religious welfare systems in the world, a network of farms, factories, canneries, silos, grain elevators, and food distribution centers capable of feeding tens of thousands. And at the institutional level, another belief runs deep. If you want to secure the future, you don't stockpile food. You secure the land that produces it. This belief, shaped by persecution, reinforced by scarcity, and sanctified by doctrine, is the foundation of why the church invests in farmland today. It's not random, it's not impulsive. It's a modern expression of a 19th century survival ethic. But there's another layer to this story. One that moves beyond history and into strategy, because the church didn't just decide to store food. It decided to control the entire process of producing it. And that leads us directly into the next part of the investigation. To understand the modern strategy behind the Mormon Church's farmland empire, we need to look deeper into a doctrine that shapes how the institution sees resources, responsibility, and the future. It's a principle that traces back to the very foundation of the faith, known as the law of consecration and stewardship. While the full religious meaning of this doctrine is complex, its practical implication can be summarized in a simple idea. Resources are not just possessions, they are responsibilities. In early Mormon teaching, everything a person had, land, food, tools, skills, was considered something entrusted to them by God to be used wisely for the good of their families and their community. This wasn't about forced communalism or abandoning private property. It was about a mindset, a belief that believers should work hard, prepare for hardship, and use resources with long-term vision. And perhaps most importantly, it was a belief that the community should never again face the kind of scarcity, famine, or persecution that had threatened its survival in the past. Over the decades, this doctrine evolved from personal preparedness to institutional planning. Church leaders increasingly emphasized self-reliance, emergency readiness, and responsible resource management. Members were taught to build food storage, pay off debts, learn practical skills, and be prepared for unexpected crises. But at the leadership level, the same principles were applied on a massive scale, far beyond individual families and far beyond local congregations. The guiding question became this: if we believe difficult times may come, shouldn't we prepare not just spiritually, but physically and economically? For the church, preparation wasn't just an act of faith, it was an act of stewardship. And stewardship meant securing the resources that sustain life: land, water, food, and the means to produce them. This worldview explains why the church invests so heavily in agriculture. In their perspective, land is more than a financial asset. It is a stable, long-term foundation for community welfare. It is a hedge against future uncertainty. It is a way to ensure that if the world ever faces disruption, whether from economic instability, natural disasters, or supply chain failures, the church will not be left vulnerable. Instead, it will be in a position not only to take care of its own members, but also to provide aid to others, as it has repeatedly done during global crises. There is a quiet but consistent logic to this strategy. Money can lose value. Markets can fluctuate. Systems can fail. But land, especially farmland, continues to produce. It continues to feed families, generate income, and build resilience. And in the doctrinal lens of the LDS Church, that makes it not just a smart investment, but a sacred one. This is why the church doesn't simply store food. It buys the farms that grow the wheat, the ranches that raise the cattle, the orchards that produce the fruit, and the timberlands that provide long-term resources. It is a modern application of a 19th century belief. Prepare spiritually, but also prepare materially. Trust in God, but also build systems that protect your people. And as we move deeper into this story, we begin to see that this doctrinal foundation isn't just about belief. It has created one of the most sophisticated agricultural strategies managed by any religious institution in the modern world. As the doctrine of preparedness evolved into institutional strategy, the Mormon Church built something that very few religious organizations and very few governments have ever managed to create: a fully integrated global food production and storage system designed to operate in times of stability and to withstand times of crisis. Across the United States, the church maintains an expansive network of grain silos, canneries, orchards, ranches, and food processing facilities. These aren't symbolic operations or small community projects. They are highly organized, large-scale systems capable of producing and distributing enormous quantities of food. In many cities, you can find bishop storehouses, essentially food distribution centers stocked with everything from rice and beans to canned fruit, cooking oil, diapers, and hygiene supplies ready to assist families during emergencies. What many people don't realize is how far-reaching this infrastructure really is. The church operates grain elevators that hold millions of pounds of wheat, ready to be milled into flour whenever needed. It maintains fruit orchards that produce apples, peaches, and pears, which are then processed in church-owned facilities and stored for long-term use. There are canneries where volunteers help package food that is distributed to households facing unexpected hardships. There are dairy farms, cattle ranches, and poultry operations that supply both church welfare programs and commercial markets. For members of the faith, personal preparedness, keeping a supply of essential food and items at home, is still encouraged. But at the institutional level, the scale goes far beyond what any family could ever store. The church maintains reserves large enough to feed tens of thousands of people for extended periods. These reserves are not hidden. In fact, they are a point of pride within the culture, representing a commitment to care for one another and to remain resilient in uncertain times. The modern world rarely thinks about food security. Most people trust grocery stores, supply chains, and global transportation networks to keep shelves stocked. But the Mormon Church learned from its own history that supply chains can break, crops fail, markets collapse, governments falter, and communities can suddenly find themselves face-to-face with scarcity. This is why the church made a strategic decision that sets it apart. Rather than depending on external suppliers for food storage, It chose to control the process from the ground up. Owning the land means owning the crops. Owning the crops means controlling the supply. And controlling the supply means being able to respond quickly when disaster strikes without waiting on outside institutions or vulnerable systems. During the COVID-19 pandemic, while many organizations scrambled to find food and essential goods, the LDS Church was able to mobilize its welfare network almost immediately. Truckloads of food left their facilities and were delivered not only to church members but to communities in need across the country. Their system didn't break. It activated. What began in the 1800s as a survival instinct for persecuted pioneers has become, in the 21st century, one of the most organized food resilience strategies of any religious group in the world. And at the heart of it is a simple but powerful idea. If you are responsible for a global community, you can't rely on chance. You prepare, you build, you store, and you ensure that when hard times come, you have something real to offer. But the church didn't stop at storing food. They went even further deep into a strategy that most people never notice and even fewer understand. As the church expanded its system of food storage and distribution, a realization emerged, one that would fundamentally reshape its long-term strategy. Storing food was powerful, but owning the means to produce food was far more powerful. It was the difference between relying on markets and mastering them, between preparing for uncertainty and securing the future. And so the church made a quiet but decisive shift. It began to invest not only in the food itself, but in the farmland, the ranches, the orchards, and the water that make food possible. This shift marked the beginning of a new era. Instead of buying wheat, the church invested in the fields that grow wheat. Instead of purchasing cattle, it acquired the land where cattle are raised and the facilities where they are processed. Instead of relying on outside suppliers of fruit, it planted orchards and built storage systems for long-term preservation. Over time, the church became not just a consumer of food but a producer and eventually a major agricultural player in the American landscape. This transformation is best illustrated through operations like Deseret Ranches in Florida, one of the largest cow-calf ranches in the United States. Stretching across nearly 300,000 acres, it includes cattle operations, citrus groves, sod farms, water reservoirs, and testing grounds for new agricultural methods. It is not an outdated symbol of pioneer life. It is a modern, industrial-scale agricultural complex managed with precision and long-term planning. And Deseret Ranches is just one example. In the Midwest, the church quietly owns vast fields of wheat, corn, and alfalfa, essential ingredients for both human food production and livestock feed. In Idaho and Utah, they operate orchards, grazing lands, and large dairies. In the Pacific Northwest, they manage timberlands that grow some of the most valuable wood in America. Across all these regions, the strategy is the same. Control the source, control the process, control the outcome. The brilliance of this approach becomes even clearer when we consider how fragile modern supply chains are. Most organizations and most families rely on long-distance transportation networks to move food from farms to shelves. But those networks can break. They did during the pandemic. They do during natural disasters. They can falter during economic downturns. The church solution was simple but rare. Build a system that is as independent as possible. Own the land, own the water rights, own the livestock, own the machinery, and own the facilities that turn raw products into something families can eat. This level of control allows the church to operate with remarkable resilience. When a hurricane hits Florida, Deseret Ranches doesn't shut down. It adapts. When drought strikes the West, the church is already investing in water rights and sustainable irrigation systems. When prices rise in the broader economy, the church's internal production softens the impact for its own welfare programs. And perhaps most importantly, control over production ensures that the church's humanitarian arm can respond instantly in moments of crisis. They don't wait for government aid or corporate donations. Their trucks leave warehouses filled with food grown on land the church owns, processed in facilities the church manages, and delivered through a welfare network the church built over generations. This isn't just agriculture. It's strategic independence. its resilience made tangible. It is the culmination of a belief that preparation is not something you talk about, it's something you build. But this agricultural expansion isn't just for survival or charity. A significant portion of it functions as a highly efficient business model, one that generates revenue, strengthens institutional stability, and funds global initiatives. And that leads us to the next chapter in this story. As the Mormon Church expanded its agricultural footprint, something became increasingly clear. This wasn't just a system for emergencies or internal welfare programs. It was also a fully functioning business model, quiet, efficient, and remarkably profitable. And at the heart of it is one of the most powerful concepts in modern economics: vertical integration. Most companies operate in fragments. One farm grows cattle, another processes the meat, another distributes it, and yet another sells the final product. Each step involves a different business, different risks, and different costs. But the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has built an agricultural system that minimizes these uncertainties by controlling nearly every stage of production. Through entities like Deseret Ranches, Farmland Reserve Inc., and Ag Reserves Inc., the Church oversees the entire journey of food, from seed to soil, from cattle to processing plant, from orchard to storage facility. They grow the crops. They raise the livestock. They manage the water. They cultivate the orchards. They own the machinery, the equipment, the barns, the processing centers, and in many cases, the distribution networks. This means the church is not just producing food for its own welfare system. It is also producing food for the commercial market: beef sold to major distributors, grains used across multiple industries, lumber harvested from church-owned timberlands, and land leased to farmers who pay rent directly into the church's financial ecosystem. These operations generate millions of dollars in revenue each year, feeding into one of the most stable and diversified religious financial structures in the world. What makes this model even more remarkable is how quietly it operates. The church does not promote these businesses as part of its public identity. There are no commercials, no flashy corporate campaigns, no loud announcements about profits or market share. Instead, the commercial activity runs in the background, consistently and efficiently, supporting a global network of humanitarian efforts, missionary programs, education systems, and community projects. During economic downturns, when other organizations struggle with rising food costs, the church benefits from owning both production and supply. When inflation hits the grocery market, their welfare system feels the impact far less. When natural disasters disrupt regional agriculture, church-owned farms in other states continue to operate, balancing out risk and maintaining resilience. And yet, despite all this, the agricultural operations are often misunderstood. Critics assume the church's farmland exists solely for survivalist reasons. Others believe it's simply a financial investment. But the reality is more complex and far more strategic. The agricultural division does provide security. It does support long-term preparedness. And yes, it also generates revenue. But more than anything, it ensures independence, financial independence, logistical independence, and humanitarian independence. Few institutions on earth, religious or secular, have built a system like this. It is a unique blend of faith, economics, and long-term planning that stretches across generations. A system that allows the church to fund global initiatives without relying heavily on outside donors, volatile markets, or government support. And yet, even this entire structure, the farms, the ranches, the orchards, the processing plants, is only one layer of the church's long-term strategy. Because behind the farmland is something even more decisive: control over the natural resources that make agriculture possible. That brings us to the part of the story most people never notice: the quiet acquisitions that reveal the full extent of the church's long-range vision. As impressive as the Mormon Church's farmland operations are, they reveal only part of a much larger strategy, one that becomes clearer when we look at the world we live in today. Because in the 21st century, land is no longer just a place to build or farm. It is power. It is leverage. And increasingly, It is the foundation of long-term security in a world that feels less stable with each passing year. To understand this, we have to look beyond the boundaries of religion and into global trends. Climate instability is reshaping the way nations think about water, food, and natural resources. Severe droughts are hitting regions that were once agricultural powerhouses. Supply chain disruptions, like those seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, have exposed how fragile modern food systems really are. Inflation has pushed the cost of basic goods to levels many families struggle to afford. And geopolitical tensions continue to affect everything from fertilizer production to global transport routes. In a world like this, the institutions that control land, especially productive land, hold a form of stability that money alone can't buy. And the Mormon Church seems to understand this better than most. Their farmland acquisitions are not random. They are not impulsive. They follow a clear, observable pattern. Buy land in regions with stable water access, strong soil quality, and long-term agricultural viability. Buy land far from coastal vulnerabilities. Buy land in states where climate predictions show lower risk of extreme future conditions. And buy land where ownership also grants access to one of the most valuable resources on the planet: fresh water. Some of the church's most strategic purchases have included properties with deep aquifers, river access, or established irrigation rights. In the American West, where water rights can be more valuable than the land itself, this is a powerful advantage. Farmland that comes with secure water isn't just an investment, it's a lifeline. And the church acquires it quietly, methodically, and with a long-term horizon that extends far beyond the next decade. The timberlands in the Pacific Northwest are another example of this long-range vision. While trees take decades to reach full value, they serve as a renewable resource, a carbon sink, and a hedge against environmental shifts. Timberland is one of the most stable long-term investments in the world, and the church treats it as such, planting, harvesting, restoring, and managing forests with the patience of an institution that thinks in generations, not quarterly earnings. Critics sometimes question why the church accumulates so much wealth, or why it operates with such financial secrecy. But whether you agree with their approach or not, there is no denying the clarity of the underlying strategy. Ensure long-term stability for the community by owning the resources that matter most when the world becomes unpredictable. And this is where the story gains its greatest significance. Because while the general public debates short-term concerns politics, markets, headlines, some institutions, from sovereign wealth funds to multinational corporations, are quietly securing the basics of future power: land, water, food production, and natural resource rights. The Mormon Church is doing precisely this, but through the lens of its own religious worldview, one that blends spiritual preparation with practical foresight. They are building a safety net that stretches across states, ecosystems, and entire industries. A system that insulates them from economic shocks and environmental change. A system that ensures they can remain financially stable, self-reliant, and humanitarianly active no matter what the future holds. Because in times of crisis, when supply chains break, when prices surge, when scarcity becomes real, the institutions that already control land and water will not simply survive, they will lead. And that is perhaps the most overlooked part of this story. The Mormon Church's farmland empire is not just an investment portfolio. It is a long-term resilient strategy, quiet, deliberate, and deeply rooted in both history and doctrine. But to fully understand its impact, we still need to explore what this means for individuals, communities, and the broader conversations about preparedness in the 21st century. Amid all the discussions about the Mormon Church's enormous wealth, its vast landholdings, and its agricultural operations, there is one truth that almost no one talks about. And yet, it may be the most important part of this entire story. While many people focus on the scale of the church's assets, far fewer recognize the pattern behind them, a pattern that reveals a deeper level of long-term planning than most institutions ever attempt. Because when you look closely, a simple reality emerges: the church is not preparing only for emergencies. It is preparing for an unpredictable world. In a time when most organizations plan year to year and most individuals plan week to week, the Mormon Church is planning in decades and generations. And that long-term thinking shapes everything they acquire: land, water rights, orchards, timberlands, grazing pastures, storage facilities, and the logistic systems that connect them all. While the public debates inflation or political cycles, the Church is quietly securing the foundational resources that societies depend on. While governments struggle to manage droughts, climate shifts, and food instability, the Church is investing in regions that are likely to remain agriculturally viable for the next 50 years. While global corporations fight for control of water access and farmland, the Church has already established a network of resilient assets spread across multiple climates and ecosystems. This isn't randomness, and it isn't reaction. It's foresight. And that foresight comes from something most critics overlook entirely: the Church's historical memory. The collective memory of a people who nearly starved in the 1800s, who crossed the continent on foot, who built communities in deserts, who learned through suffering that survival cannot depend on outside systems alone. That memory lives inside the institution today, shaping every investment, every acquisition, every quiet purchase of farmland in an out-of-the-way county no one is paying attention to. To the Church, this is not speculation. It is stewardship. It is responsibility. It is preparation on a scale that aligns with their belief that communities should be resilient, self-sufficient, and ready for hardship. Whether those hardships are spiritual, economic, environmental, or social, the philosophy remains the same. You prepare now, not later. And when you step back, you begin to see the deeper message emerging from this agricultural network. It is not about wealth for wealth's sake. It is not about secrecy for secrecy's sake. It is about securing stability in a world that is becoming increasingly unstable, about ensuring that a global community of millions will not be left vulnerable. When systems fail, markets collapse, or crises erupt without warning. If the 20th century taught institutions to trust global supply chains, the 21st century is teaching them to rethink that trust. The Mormon Church learned the lesson early, and their farmland empire stands as the quiet proof. Because in the end, this story isn't simply about land. It's about foresight. It's about resilience. It's about seeing the world as it is and preparing for the world as it may become. And that brings us to the real takeaway of this investigation: what this level of preparation means not just for the Church, but for anyone paying attention. So what do we take away from all this? What does it mean that one religious institution has quietly built one of the most extensive agricultural networks in the United States? What does it mean that they control land, water, crops, cattle, and forests across multiple regions while most people barely know it's happening? The answer isn't found in speculation or conspiracy. It's found in something far more grounded: long-term thinking. The Mormon Church's farmland empire is not the product of impulse or fear. It is the product of a worldview shaped by hardship, refined by history, and guided by a doctrine that places extraordinary value on preparation. It is a strategy built by a community that once suffered extreme scarcity and vowed never to be vulnerable again. A community that understands how quickly stability can vanish. A community that believes preparation is not an act of paranoia, but an act of stewardship. And whether or not you share their beliefs, there is something undeniably powerful about that mindset. Most people today live in a world of instant convenience. Food appears on shelves, water flows from taps, and global systems seem unbreakable until the moment they break. The pandemic showed just how fragile these systems really are. A drought can empty reservoirs. A storm can shut down supply lines. A global conflict can disrupt entire industries. In a world like this, institutions that control essential resources have something rare: stability. What the Mormon Church has built is not just an agricultural machine. It is a buffer against uncertainty, a hedge against volatility, a structure designed to protect a global community, not for years, but for generations. And in that sense, it is less about wealth and more about resilience, less about accumulation and more about responsibility. If nothing else, this story challenges us to think differently about the future, to question whether our own communities, institutions, And families are prepared for a world that is changing faster than we realize. To ask whether we have placed too much trust in systems that are far more fragile than they appear. You don't need to agree with the church's theology to appreciate its foresight. You don't need to join its faith to recognize the wisdom in building something that lasts. And you don't need to admire every decision it makes to understand the power of planning beyond yourself, of thinking in decades rather than days. Perhaps the real lesson here is simple. The future belongs to those who prepare for it. And in an era defined by uncertainty, the Mormon Church has built one of the most quietly prepared institutions on earth. Whether that inspires concern, admiration, or reflection is up to each of us. But ignoring it? That may be the one option the future won't allow. If this investigation gave you something to think about, I invite you to stay with us. Here, we explore stories that shape power, belief, and the hidden systems that quietly influence the world around us. No sensationalism, no outrage, just thoughtful analysis and a deeper look into the questions most people never stop to ask. If you'd like to see more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps this community grow and allows us to bring forward stories that deserve a closer, more respectful examination. And I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe religious organizations should invest in resources like Farmland? Does this kind of long-term planning reassure you, or does it raise new questions? And how prepared do you think our own society is for the uncertainties of the future? Share your perspective in the comments. I read them all, and your voice adds depth to every story we tell here. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and may you find wisdom in every story.